Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 20. A Gathering. Following their surprise meeting at the cemetery, Ulrich led Tiberius and his remaining Rostim through the darkened streets of town to an old store in the midst of Aram that Tiberius immediately recognized as the lost art of Jejunga. The Tepish had destroyed the sign long ago. The large front window was gone, and the door no longer latched, but he instantly recognized his former long-standing yet covert Rostim training ground. Ulrich stepped through the open space that once held the window, but Tiberius paused. "Ulrich," he said, looking the old store over. Ulrich quietly looked at him in response. "Far be it from me to question your methods, old friend, but why here?" "Well," Ulrich replied, "if I were you, I would never come back here. And since the fundamental difference between the Rostim and Tepish involves revenge, the Tepish would also believe you would never come back here. Therefore, they would never search here. That makes this place safe enough for now." Tiberius nodded. He fully agreed with Ulrich's logic, but Ulrich's "for now" was a very accurate description of how safe this place was in Tiberius' opinion. Following the exposure of Vladimir's betrayal after Eruftium, the Tepish had raided the lost art of Jejunga almost immediately, so Tiberius had never returned. The Tepish had placed one of their own in Tiberius' place, but the word that the Tepish had driven Tiberius out of his home, and to avoid his Jejunga shop, passed around the Rostim quickly. Tiberius walked through the ruined doorway into what was left of the business where he had spent most of his nights for a century and a half. The barrel of the wooden practice swords rested against a wall covered in dust. The training mat he once had on the floor was gone. He glanced to a table in the back, where he once had placed a clock that he had purchased in Nuremberg 100 years ago, but the clock was gone for long enough that an even layer of dust disguised the fact that it had ever sat there. He sighed and followed Ulrich's rapid pace to the exposed front half of the building. They walked into the concealed back half, which the Tepish had completely gutted right back to the stone walls. Nothing that Tiberius possessed remained, and he had not expected to find anything either. Life was far more important than possessions, so he had let it all go in order to preserve his life and lead the Rostim against the growing threat of the Tepish. At the moment, however, the former lost art of Jejunga would serve admirably as a resting place to give them a chance to regroup. The first thing Tiberius noticed when they entered was that there were only a handful of Alewa waiting for them. "Is this it?" Tiberius asked Ulrich, surprised. Ulrich shook his head. "Like you, we never keep all our forces in one location," Ulrich replied. "We cannot risk being overrun. These are the survivors from the Tepish raid on my location. To my knowledge, they have found only 2 of our other outposts." Tiberius nodded. He gestured to his Rostim to relax. After the suffocating day they had in the catacombs, Tiberius knew they would be more than grateful to rest in a place where they could breathe. Tiberius, however, could not rest. Ulrich only watched him as he paced. His mind reeled with the day's events. "Tiberius," Ulrich said. Tiberius' gaze snapped to him. "You should rest. If you were indeed the prey of the Tepish for a full day, then you are very likely exhausted." "Ulrich, these creatures of the Tepish are unlike anything I've ever seen," Tiberius rattled out, ignoring Ulrich's comment. "They were fast and nearly unstoppable. They seemed faster than we are, and they moved like animals." "If they were acting on instinct," Ulrich suggested, "then that may give them their extra speed. They would not think about their actions. Though your fighting skill is second nature to you, you still consider your next move, no matter how quickly you execute it. They are using that split second of thought to attack in any way they can. Sometimes, a battle against someone untrained can be more difficult than against one with years of experience." Tiberius nodded in agreement. "It's bad enough that the Tepish persist in continuing our race, which is already a perversion of humanity, but this new creation is intolerable. We have to stop this outrage, Ulrich. We cannot allow the Tepish to further pervert humanity like this." "And yet our previous run on the Tepish fortress met with disastrous results," Ulrich pointed out. Tiberius nodded. He remembered. 4 years ago they had rallied the Rostim and Alewo for an attack. The Tepish were far stronger than they had anticipated, and the Rostim and Alewo lost more than half of their forces. Since neither the Rostim nor the Alewo actively transmutate Fempiror into their cause, rebuilding their forces takes a long time. They had resorted to attempting to undermine the Tepish, but it was slow work. It was only recently that they had increased to the point that an attack might have had a chance. Now, with the Tepish routing them out of their outposts, their numbers were down again. They needed to do something. "If at the cost of my life we may stop the spread of these things," Tiberius said, "then I willingly sacrifice it." "We cannot ask our people to do this," Ulrich said. "Of course we can't," Tiberius said. "They've been through enough, but if we don't stop this thing now, it will spread. We couldn't fight them. What chance would humans have? None. I volunteer, and we shall take volunteers. I'll go alone if I must." "I am sure that will not be necessary," Ulrich assured him. "We shall make it known what we intend to do, and when we mean to do it. That way no one is compelled to follow, and they need not turn from our face if they wish to preserve their lives. If they desire to come, they only need show up at the appointed place and time." Tiberius nodded. This was far better than lining everyone up and telling them to go if they wished. No one leaves in such a circumstance. But simply spreading the word allows those who want to fight to come, and those who cannot to stay in safety, hopefully to mount a new attack if or when theirs fails. For his part, Tiberius hoped he had more than 5 Rostim to offer. "Have you heard from any of my other Rostim?" Tiberius asked, unable to prevent the concern from coming through his voice. "Those who were not in my party when we moved." 15 Rostim were found at your new quarters," Ulrich said. "We brought them to one of our other locations." Tiberius closed his eyes and breathed out a rush of air in frustration. He knew how many should have arrived. "Less than half of that party," Tiberius said. "These mutations must be stopped." "Do you have any others?" Ulrich asked. Tiberius nodded. There was a fair contingent of Rostim in hiding outside of Aram. Tiberius would never have kept every Rostim here. Part of the Rostim responsibility was watching humanity to prevent the Tepish transmutations, and though the bulk of the Tepish forces stayed in Aram, they still ran across the occasional Redel Kurtz, working to bring more troops into the Tepish fold. "Then I shall spread the word among my people," Ulrich said, interrupting Tiberius' thoughts, "and allow you to do the same with yours." "We leave as soon as possible," Tiberius said. Ulrich nodded, and as soon as they had worked out a time and location, Ulrich slipped out of the lost art of Djunga with several of his Alewo to spread the word. Tiberius needed to get word to the Rostim outside of Aram, but glancing at the Rostim who had just escaped death, he could hardly ask them to run out of town. "I know we're all tired from the events of the past day and night," Tiberius said as he walked up to them, "but I need a volunteer to go to the Rostim contact at Hafenstadt." "I'll go," Yori piped up first. "I hate to ask this of you, but we need the help," Tiberius said apologetically. "It's all right," Yori said. "I did get some rest when we waited in the crypts. I'll be fine." "I'll go with her," Tyrion said. Tiberius nodded and reiterated the details he and Ulrich had discussed. It was a fairly simple plan. The armies would mass on a side street near the main road that led to the fortress in 2 hours. There, he would tell them of their intent and about the mutation. As Tiberius stood at the doorway to the back of his former training center, his mind went to David. He was supposed to have met David this evening to get an update on Kalirum. He wondered what David and Beth would do when no one from the Rostim or Alewo showed up at the cave. He wondered how they were doing together. It was the sincere hope of him and Ulrich that they could find happiness together, as neither seemed satisfied in their lives. They were well trained, however, and Tiberius could only hope they would be able to handle whatever came their way. An hour passed before Yori and Tyrion returned, having spoken to a group of Rostim who promised to spread the word among their ranks. Due to the short time frame, those Rostim had expressed regret that they might not be able to inform as many as they would have liked, but they would tell as many as they could. The second hour passed too slowly for Tiberius as he waited and wondered how many would come. He felt that if their forces were large enough, they would have a chance to defeat the mutations if they could team up against them. He glanced to the other Rostim. They reclined and rested. No one spoke a word during the entire time. it was just as well. Tiberius wanted them to rest, in case they desired to follow him once more. When the time came to go to the meeting place, Tiberius left without a word to the other Rostim. He did not want to give them the impression that he expected any of them to fight after the evening they had. He was aware, however, that all of them followed him, as he expected they would. Their unwavering loyalty was unfortunate in that they would probably follow him unceasingly to their deaths, which is where this path was most likely to lead. He walked quickly through the streets to the side street where he and Ulrich had agreed to mass. The route carefully avoided crossing in front of the fortress, just in case someone was watching on this night. As they turned the last corner, Tiberius stopped. His mouth opened in awe. The sight was staggering. With his 5 survivors, there were close to 40 Rostim and at least that many Alewo packing the small side street. Ulrich spared a rare smile to Tiberius as he approached. "I trust this meets with your approval," Ulrich said. Tiberius nodded silently. Ulrich stepped back and allowed Tiberius to come forward to address the group. Tiberius stood before them, and they gave him their silent attention. Somewhere inside of him, a hope arose, and he felt like they had a chance now. "Loyal Fempiror," Tiberius called out, unconcerned over any Tepish overhearing him. "We stand at the edge of our doom. The Tepish have committed an act against nature by creating what can only be determined as true vampires. They are faster than we are and just as strong. They walk in sunlight. But worst of all, they drink blood. We must stop this perversion at any cost, even our lives. You have all volunteered for this mission with the knowledge that you may not return. We go against the fortress of the Tepish where it began. We must stop this nightmare before it spreads. If we don't, we might not be able to. We give our lives for the generations to follow. We will not allow this blight on the earth to continue. If we die for those who will live. Tonight, we fight." A cheer erupted across the rough formation. These Fempiror came for this cause, and this alone. They needed no convincing, no rallying. They only needed the word to march. Tiberius walked to Ulrich, who waited patiently. They shook hands for luck before the battle. "To death, old friend," Tiberius said. "To death," Ulrich replied. Tiberius and Ulrich walked to the head of the formation, and without a word they proceeded around the corner in full view of the Tepish fortress. Ulrich pulled his hood over his face. The Alewo behind him did the same. 2 guards stood at the entrance to the fortress, but curiously no one emerged from its doors. The guards threw their helmets to the ground and snarled at their approach. It was then that Tiberius saw their teeth. Mutations guarded the fortress. He exchanged a glance with Ulrich, who nodded in return. Tiberius drew his sword. In response, a resounding rush of metal on metal rippled across the formation as the Rostim followed Tiberius' lead. Tiberius raised his sword high above his head. The guards hunched down, ready to spring. Tiberius let out a guttural roar as he ran toward the guards. His army charged behind him. The mutations sprang for them, but they stood no chance against the combined force. The group knocked the mutations down and trampled them as they reached the doors of the fortress and tore through them into its huge foyer. The army gathered in the entryway and gazed upwards toward the ceiling 3 floors above them, and again the horrific ingenuity of the Tepish took Tiberius' breath away as he saw dozens of mutations scurry across the ceiling and out of the balconies, making their way toward the waiting group. Tiberius was dumbfounded. He had believed they would be fighting against Tepish and only a few mutations. It appeared that they were against only mutations, as no Tepish emerged from the ground floor. As he looked at the mutations quickly approaching, he saw several of them wearing remnants of the Tepish armor, and like the mutations they fought earlier, these wore no shoes or stockings, and Tiberius suspected they would be unable to cling to the walls if they wore any footwear. He wondered if the Tepish had purposely changed their people into mutations, or if the mutations had invaded the fortress and turned on their creators. It would be rather poetic justice, Tiberius thought, considering that the Tepish had originally turned on Voivode. It made no difference at this time, however. His eyes followed the mutations as they ran on all fours across the floors and walls, only moments away from their attack. "Prepare yourselves," Tiberius called out, raising his sword. The mutations reached the floor. They leapt for the army without abandon. The battle was on.